بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفينا وطبيب قلوبنا ونور أعيننا عبدك وخليلك وصفيك ووصيك بالقاسم محمد وآله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته وإسرته وأعوانه وأنصاره إلى يوم الدين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين آمين يا رب. This is a book review of this book, Overfitting and Heuristics in Philosophy by Timothy Williamson, the famous analytic philosopher from Oxford, reviewed by Daniel Greco, Yale University. Okay, so what happened to this? Timothy Williamson's Overfitting and Heuristic in Philosophy is both a work of philosophical methodology and a series of case studies in which that methodology is applied to various debates in metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of language. Williamson is a paradigmatic bullet biter. He is known for defending the view that there is a single hair that marks the boundary between being bald and not, and that he, along with the rest of us and everyone else, could not have failed to exist. So existence is necessity. I remember his essay with another guy where he denies implicit knowledge, I think. So probably that's what he means by bullet biter. While other philosophers might bend over backwards to avoid commitment to such consequences, overfitting and heuristic borrows some methodological tools from contemporary science to argue that philosophers as a group are too quick to modify powerful explanatory theories in the face of putative counterexamples. I mean, if you want to stick to a view philosophically, you can stick to most of the views with very good or seemingly very good arguments. But the point is, what's the point is, what's the point of it? So that's the main question, I guess. While I have my quibbles with various of the applications, see below, in my view, the book makes a powerful persuasive case for adding the concept of overfitting and heuristics to the philosophical toolkit, thereby nudging towards more Williamsonian willingness to buy simplicity at the price of counterintuitiveness. That's fun, because intuition is just, among other things, is the child of your upbringing and your environment. Really, what is intuitive for you might be counterintuitive for someone grown in a different environment. Heuristics first. What does heuristics first? So heuristic, linguistically speaking, one dictionary meaning is problem solving through methods such as experimentation, evaluation, solving um, through method, such as trial and error. I think it means rules of thumb, which are easy to use but might not be, entirely error free or something like that. In computing, they think proceeding to solution by trial or error or by rules that are only loosely defined. Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah, so they're trying to use it's Williamson trying to use rules like that in philosophy. It comes from its origin is Greek apparently. Heuristic, find to find, and from there it came in Latin. From there it seems to have come to modern English, I guess. So heuristic is basically a simple method or method that or rule of thumb that helps to find an answer, though not always the best or correct. So I guess you will need heuristic for situation where you need to make a decision, but you don't have enough time, etc. But why would you use such method in philosophy? You have all the time in the world. Let's see what is reasoning. So philosopher will likely to be familiar with the basic idea. When exact calculation is costly, we rely on quick and dirty rules that are reliable enough in most environments. Williamson argues that this fact can undercut putative counterexamples in philosophy. So it's basically a conservative in a literal sense move, in the sense that you want to keep what you have in face of uh, in the face of intelligent counterexample. So it is conservative in the sense that conservative of, so you don't easily give up your taken for granted beliefs uh, in the face of intelligent or persuasive counterexample or seemingly persuasive counterexample, and you try to hold your ground as far as possible and using these rules of thumb to reject these counterexamples, even though those rules of thumbs are not you know foolproof or foul-proof. For instance, like the above mentioned judgment that on one hair cannot make the difference between being bald and not. can't make the difference between being born. This and other tolerance judgment famously give rise to paradox. Williamson rejects them. Rejects what? For instance, take the above mentioned judgment that the one here can't make the difference between being bald and not. And he says that it can make a difference between being bald. He invokes heuristics as part of an error theory to make that rejection easier to swallow. What was that? Williamson is a paradigmatic bullet biter. He is known for defending the view that there is a single hair that marks the boundary. He invokes heuristic as part of an error theory to make that rejection easier to swallow. Williamson argues that tolerance judgments are exactly what we would expect from generally reliable but fallible persistent heuristics. We default to assuming small changes make no difference because in everyday life that saves time and is usually safe. Okay, that's fine, but why it's relevant in philosophy? That's the point. Unless you are trying to make philosophy as a defender of your so-called daily life and its perception. Williamson marshaled a variety of consideration in support of the idea that some heuristics along these lines play an essential role in making cognition tractable, and that it sometimes, even in cases that don't involve vagueness, can go very wrong. Williamson marshals a variety of considerations in support of the idea that some heuristic along with these lines are essential roles in making cognition tractable, and that tractable tractable. Okay, so next is overfitting. That was an example of heuristic. In machine learning, a model with lots of free parameters be tuned to match every training datum. In machine learning, a model with lots of free parameters can be tuned to match every training datum. What does match mean? Incorporate or yet that very flexibly makes it fragile on new cases. Williamson claims that the same pathology afflicts many philosophical theories. Here is an illustrative example. Influential, explanatory, powerful formal models of belief in philosophy and economics have the result that why they keep bringing other subjects, I don't understand. I mean, you can apply to those, but just focus on your own subject first. Unless you are a economics, buff. Is an illustrative example. Influential, explanatory, powerful formal models of belief in philosophy and economics have the result that agents who believe P, and if P then Q, thereby believe P. So that's modus ponens. And so here's an illustrative example. Influential, explanatory, powerful forms of belief. In philosophy and economics have the result that agents who believe P and believe P and if P then Q, thereby this seems like a bad consequence, as it is possible, isn't it, to believe P and without believing Q? So this contradiction, obviously, this is a valid form, valid inferential form, but then you are fitting belief into it, and those forms are not for belief; those are for propositions or sentences or whatever they are. Some philosophers respond by enriching their formal models of belief, characterizing the concept belief in terms of impossible worlds, or some other hyper intentional machinery, until any pattern ascent and descent can be any pattern of ascent and descent can. In other words, they don't just apply these philosophers. They're talking about formal models to beliefs, but try to come up with a more congenial model of its own to understand what we can believe and can't believe. But Williamson argues this amounts to overfitting on intuitive data, meaning about the possibility of logical theoretical frameworks flexible enough to represent logical tend to be so flexible that they sacrifice all their explanatory power. Okay, so Williamson's concept is the opposite. Keep the streamlined, logically omniscient model of belief as the best formula we have got. Acknowledge that ordinary thinkers fall short of that model in ways that is not particularly fruitful to capture in a systematic theory. You can do that, but what's so, and bite whatever bullets that entails. You can do that, but you can also do the other thing. You can have two ways to understand the same things. What's the problem? Better to tolerate some apparent counterexample than to torture your theory until it becomes a mirror to data it pretends to explain. I mean, all philosophical explanations ultimately are of this sort anyway. I mean, practiced by Williamson and his colleagues, his fellows and his opponents, but overfitting. So you can't just change your theory in order to explain a new. So in that sense, Williamson seems to be right, but he should have actually questioned the first move, that is the move why you're trying to understand beliefs on the model of inference, which is, functional in its nature, and in the sense that it understands the implication or relationship between fixed symbols and what those fixed symbols represent. Well, they might be proposition or sentences depending on your view of the logic involved. And you could have just you can just say that if we are applying it to belief, but belief are different sorts of things than independent claims or symbols, and that's why they are not going to work all the time. So there are many ways you can escape all those things. A recurring theme in the book is Williamson's defense of intentional over hyper-intentional framework for doing metaphysics. And how are you going to differentiate between these two frameworks? For doing metaphysics, semantics, and philosophy of mind and language, very roughly, intentional framework cannot distinguish between necessary equivalents, while hyper-intentional framework can. if it is necessary that an action maximizes the happiness, if and only if it is right, then happiness maximization and rightness are the very same property. And intentional metaphysics will not distinguish them. Similarly, if Superman flies and Clark Kent flies are necessarily equivalent, then they express the very same proposition. So if propositions are the objects of beliefs, anyone who believes in Superman flies believes that Clark can fly. Not necessarily, because propositions are the objects of belief. The objects of belief, but they are not beliefs. In the belief in their entirety, because belief has subjective elements which objects don't have. Anyway, these consequences can seem absurd. Isn't it part of utilitarian doctrine that happiness maximization ground rightness, but not vice versa? This seems really stupid. Very roughly, intentional framework cannot distinguish between necessary equivalent, while hyper-intentional framework can, if it is necessary that an action maximizes happiness if and only if it is right, then happiness maximization, if it is necessary that an action maximizes happiness if and only if it is right, then happiness maximization and rights are very same property. Maybe, but they are not very same concepts. Anyway, I think one of the reason is that these logician type of philosophers, or one who grew up playing with language, they often take examples from the subject they don't probably fully understand. For example, utilitarianism, maybe that's not their forte. I don't know. So these consequences can seem absurd. Isn't it part of utilitarian doctrine that happiness maximum grounds rightness, but not vice versa? Yeah, I don't see any problem. Anyway, this sort of asymmetric, but I'm not against this quibble, because I think this quibble just sharpens the tools. So Williamson's type of philosophy is good in the sense that it ends up sharpening and inventing new tools, new heuristics, and new techniques. But yeah, so there are a lot of unintended consequences of this sort of quibbling, which I think is good. This sort of asymmetric relationships are only possible if happiness maximization and rightness are not the very same property. This sort of asymmetric relationship is only possible if happiness maximization and rightness are not the very same property. And isn't it possible to believe that Superman flies without believing that Clark flies? Yes, of course it is possible. For example, if you don't know that Superman is the same person as Clark, I don't see any problem. But anyway, intentional metaphysics seems to leave us unable to even express the position of metaphysics and want to debate. Yes, but that intentional frame cannot differ between necessary equivalent. As I said, I don't know what intentional frameworks is because they're different things. But one of the problems which I can see just through this review is that if you apply, for example, inferential logic to belief, then you are applying something which is which conceptualize totally different, or which conceptualize things which are different than beliefs. So if you are applying to beliefs, you are going to get those sort of uh, counter examples, or those sort of paradoxes. You should expect it. um, so is Williamson saying the same thing? Maybe he's saying the same thing. Williamson argues, however, that hyperintent frames fail to explain these distinctions. Rather, they merely provide a language in which distinctions can be stated. Okay. To get the desired results, one typically has to put them in by hand, stipulating that and receive distinct semantic values, or that rightness and utility are distinct properties. Well, you can say rightness and utility is a relation of different concepts, and maybe because of that they will refer to different properties without driving these distinctions from independent predictively fruitful principles. To see why this is a problem, note that we don't want to be able to capture the difference between believing that a God created the universe and believing that a deity created the universe. But the flexibility afforded by hyperintent can just as easily distinguish God as it can distinguish. What's wrong with that then? But Williamson argues to have linear intentional models that fail to fit some data. Okay, I don't have any problem with that, for the sake of being able to generally explain the data that they do capture. Well, I doubt that they were explaining any data before that anyway. You were projecting certain concept onto certain other things, and that's all. The understanding will come through understanding the actuality of what you are trying to understand, not by projecting one method to a different or one set of heuristics to a different set of problems. I referred to the previous paragraph. Data. Williamson is explicit in overfitting heuristic philosophy in adopting a non-factive conception of data, and distinguishes between data from evidence. Okay, maybe he is overfitting here. Data, of course, data, you can distinguish between data and evidence, but data can be evidence. You have to. So they are not the same thing, but evidence can be data and data can be evidence. Evidence, according to Williamson, is knowledge, and knowledge must be true. Knowledge must be true. Knowledge must be true. What does that mean? Unless you say knowledge is true belief. If you say true belief, then you can say it depends on your definition of knowledge. But data can be false. How can data be false? Beliefs can be false. How can data be false? I don't know. He seems to conceive of debates between himself as concerning how best to explain a shared body of data consisting in the contents of various philosophical judgments. Williamson will grant that it is a datum that one grain of sand cannot make the difference between a heap and non-heap datum. I would say it is a claim. And of course, you can treat a claim as a datum as well. Or that someone can believe that Superman flies without believing that Clark Kent flies. He just holds that when one considers these data together with lots of other relevant data and aims to adopt a model that best explains the totality of the data, one will end up favoring models in which data hyperintentionally is emphasized, end up one will end up favoring models in which the data hyper-intentional is emphasized, end up being understood as something like outliers. Okay. While I doubt there is any strict inconsistency with this approach and his earlier work, I do want to draw attention to some differences in emphasis. Okay. In both 2000 and 2007, evidence is a central category. And its factivity, why not facticity, plays an important role in the dialectic of both books, meaning argument. The skeptic who tries to convince you that you don't know you have hands, or that you don't know that there are composite objects, can't really be debated but should instead be dismissed. Okay. That's old old philosophical approach, for example, which was suggested against sophists, for example. And Taftazani in his Maqasid, when he talks about sophists, he says that they can't be sophists and skeptics. They can't be refuted. They should be, bashed. And then they will realize that there is out of order. In particular, it's a mug game. It is a mug's game to retreat to some dialectically uncontroversial body of evidence consisting of how things seems to you or that you are inclined to judge, and to then try to argue for your views over a skeptical alternatives appealing only to the impoverished set of consideration. Is he now criticizing him or what? The skeptic who tries to convince you that you don't know your own hands, you don't know you have hands, or that you don't. He might not be trying to convince you you don't know your hands, but he might want to convince you that if somebody raise a doubt about your hands, you can't prove it to them if he is consistent enough or insistent enough, or that you don't know that there are composite objects. Can't really be debated but should instead be dismissed. Well, that's your own judgment, because if you want to keep on debating, you can keep on debating. But if you want to, terminate a debate, then you can terminate a debate. But that doesn't mean that you have actually proven your opponent wrong. In particular, it's a mug's game. It's a mug's game. In particular, it's a mug's game to retreat to some dialectically uncontroversial body of evidence consisting of how things seems to you or what you are so inclined to judge, and then try to argue for you over skeptical alternatives, appealing only to that impoverished set of consideration. Okay. In this book, however, if it is Williamson's in the position of the skeptic, arguing that the intentional framing shouldn't be dismissed on the basis of putative effects inconsistent with them. Now he is on psychologizing the evidence, or rather the data, arguing that, example, he can explain why we make the judgments that one grain of sand can't make the difference between heap and non-heap in terms of the operation of fallible heuristic. Okay, probably critique. It is a fruitful exercise, I think, to imagine how hyper-intentional medicine might appeal to Williamson's early work to resist such a strategy. Yeah. If my only relevance was that I judged that there is a difference between believing that Superman flies and believing that Clark can fly, then your strategy might be opposite. But my evidence is that there is such a difference, and therefore I can know that your intentional metaphysics is false. Of course, it's also a running theme in Williamson's work that we can be mistaken about what our evidence is. I'm sure that that's how he would diagnose my hypothetical hyperintentionalist. I small quibbles to my if my only relevant evidence was that I judge that there is a difference between believing that superfluous, then your strategy might be opposite. But my evidence is that there is such a difference. If I know that you, of course, it's also a running theme in a few quibbles. Okay. In my judgment, Williamson makes a powerful case for thinking of the persistence of heuristic as a general purpose cognitive shortcut that may misfire when thinking about semantics of vagueness. So this is just explanation of everyday or common practice and why it is generally rational law. I think he is on weaker ground in his discussion of what he calls suppositional heuristics for the indicative conditional. Many writers have some version of the following view that indicative conditional if A, B expresses a conditional endorsement of B on the supposition that A. This idea is associated with Ramsey's tests for conditional to decide whether to endorse if A, B. First suppose A and then within this curve that's consider whether B. Whatever your attitude towards B under the supposition that A, that should be your attitude toward if A, B. Williamson's view defended in 2000 is that the natural language indicative conditional is just the material conditional, which is if A, B is true, just in case if A then B. The Ramsey test rather than playing a constitutive role in determining the meaning of the indicative is merely a heuristic we use to decide whether the material conditional is true. Okay, let's read it again. A small quibble is a few small quibbles. In my judgment, Williamson makes a case for thinking of the persistent heuristic as a general purpose cognitive shortcut that may misfire when thinking about some semantics of vagueness. I think he is on weaker ground in his discussion what he calls suppositional heuristics. If for the indicative conditional, and then he gives example of Ramsey's test, which is not material test, which is suppositional test, and I think Williamson's point is that if A, B in natural language simply means the material conditional, if A then B it simply means material conditionals. And on his view, Ramsey's test is not the part of meaning of condition, just a heuristic. Okay. A cognitive shortcut we use when checking whether a material conditional is true. Material conditional just mean so material conditional if A then B. It's just that when it's so it means if this is true, this is going to true. Sorry. the only time it can be. So this is false, this is true, this is true, this is false, this is false, this is true, and only time this is actually false is this is true and this is false. So this is false. This is the material meaning of. So what Williamson is saying is that's the meaning of indicative conditional. That's the meaning. On the other hand, Ramsey's test is a supposition. He said, if A, then B. If you want to test whether this is a true argument, what you do is you suppose A. And that's what he's explaining in there, what we read. Suppose A, and then ask yourself whether B would hold. Imagine basically. Hold meaning would be true. So suppose if A is true, would B be true, for example? And according to Ramsey, this test seems to show that the meaning of if A, B is tied to supposition, that is, imagining A. But Williamson is saying no. The meaning is just the material one which we just described. He said that if A, B in natural language, which means human language, simply means material conditional. And Ramsey's test is not a part of meaning, not a part of meaning of condition. It is just a heuristic, a cognitive shortcut in checking whether a material conditional is true. Now, the reviewer, Greco, what's his name? Greco, yeah. His critique is that we just read that, which, and he probably will elaborate on this in the next. He's saying that Williamson's claim that Ramsey's test is merely heuristic is unpersuasive or weaker than his other arguments. So in short, what he's saying is Williamson may be right about reasoning about vagueness, relies on misleading heuristics, and it shouldn't, but his claim that our reasoning about if-then sentence is just a heuristic also applied to material conditions is much less convincing. What do I think? Well, even the first claim that its material meaning is what the logic teaches us. I mean, even that is, I think that's just by definition. And how does natural language work? You would have to trace people's usage in different contexts. That would be very hard. So my intuition is that Williamson there is empirically and linguistically probably his view is questionable. And psychological and linguistic evidence, I would say, would suggest that if A then B has much richer and more context sensitive meaning than A, B, that is the material conditional as studied in logic. And that seems obvious because logic doesn't capture, because it is form, it doesn't capture the context sensitivity of the natural language. Okay, so Ramsey test, etc. The Ramsey's test, rather than playing a constitutive role in determining the meaning of the indicative, it is merely heuristic. That's Williamson's way. If he wanted heuristic for fallibly deciding whether the material condition of the we could do a lot better than the suppositional heuristic. Consider a case where A is obviously overwhelmingly unlikely, while B is difficult to evaluate on the supposition that A. Executing the suppositional heuristic will be cognitively costly and may lead to false judgment. For instance, if alien spaceships land on Earth tomorrow, would world leaders will respond by attacking them. If you want a heuristic for evaluating a claim considered as a material conditional, it is very easy. Just affirm it. You are almost certain to be right, since it is almost certain that aliens won't land on the Earth. Or, by contrast, if you use a suppositional heuristic, you will have to think pretty hard. How would leaders respond? If you judge understandably that they wouldn't attack and so end up denying the conditional, you are almost certainly going wrong. If we really were trying to guess the truth of it would make much more sense to preserve the supposition for conditional in which the antecedent has a decent chance of being true. But on the other hand, in Ramsey's test, Ramsey says is suppose A, and then ask yourself whether B would hold. This test seems to show that the meaning of A then B is tied to a supposition. Imagining A. If you imagine A and then ask yourself will be a hold. That's the meaning. So the reviewer is saying that in the counter example he gave, is saying that Ramsey's test is not a heuristic because of the reason he just mentioned. My last nit to pick, I don't know whether my last nit to pick concerns, I think the end bit is not, I tried to convert it into PDF, the last bit has always hasn't, so that has been cut. So I'll just read that and see if there is. My last nitpick to concern guys relatively to which Williamson appeals in attempting to make his treatment of Frege cases more palatable. It is a familiar thought that the same proposition can be believed under different guises. Okay, let me read from online one. Okay, so my last, where did that went? My last nitpick to concerning Guy's relative belief to which Williams appealed in attempting to make his treatment of Frege cases more palatable, it is palatable. It is a familiar thought that the same proposition can be believed under different guises and the action varies with the guise. But Williamson offers no theory of guises, and no constraint on how beliefs under guises interact with values to rationalize choice. If, like me, you take the smooth interface between intentionalism and rational choice theory to be a chief virtue of the view, economist model belief along intentional line, it is deflating to adopt an intentionalism that gives up on explaining data concerning rational choice. Intentionalists should work hard not to sideline this data. While Williamson's fragmentationist version of intentionalism only, while Williamson mentions fragmentationist versions of intentionalism only to set them aside, in my view, they provide the most promising route for reconciling intentionalism with rational choice theory. I think that's just the in one last paragraph. He um, boxed so much, would be hard to unpack. Let's see what he says at the end. Even where I disagree with his application, I find it natural and useful, fruitful to do so in his idiom. I agree that we can debunk counterexample by identifying heuristic, but just disagree about whether he is plausibly identified. He has plausibly identified heuristic in this or that case. I agree that we can dismiss recalcitrant, recalcitrant, recalcitrant data as outliers if it is necessary for retaining an overall simple and explanation. But I certainly is too quick to dismiss it. That's just like at the end he's just trying to not criticize him thoroughly enough. That's fair enough, but let's see if we need to unpack that previous paragraph, otherwise we'll finish it here. So the guy's relative, what he's mentioning here is guys the belief that a person can believe the same thing under different guys. It's guys, meaning descriptions. To handle, what does he say, Fageloid case? Fageloid case meaning Halley believes that Superman can fly, and Ali believes that Clark Kent can fly. Did I say believes? Doesn't believe. So that's a paradox. But Ali might believe this because he doesn't know that Superman and Clark are the same. And personally, for me, it's not a paradox because believes. I mean, beliefs can be paradoxical, and paradox can be removed by pointing out to these sort of things. But the contradiction are independent of belief, that they are between sentences. So belief is not a. So Superman can't fly, and Superman can fly, and Clark Kent can fly. They have the same truth value as independent propositions. Now, anyway, so what this reviewer is saying is that Williamson uses this idea. Williamson, what he's saying is Williamson use of idea is too thin, meaning he invokes guises without giving a real account of what they are in his book and how they affect the rational decision. And probably he works in rational decision making theory. That's right. Is not happy with that, and also he mentions fragmentationist school, which probably gives a method to solve these. Fragmentationist version of intentionalism, and he mentioned Elga and Roy. Seems to so his criticism of Williamson is that Guy's relative beliefs. He invokes Guy's relative belief too loosely. without explaining how it fits with rational decision making. And his criticism is that more developed fragmentatious theories, as explained by Alga and Rios, for example, in their 2002 book, do a better job of reconciling our intuitions about belief with theories of rational choice. I think that's enough. Or maybe unfair to say. Let's see. Law. And Ali doesn't believe that Superman can fly. Okay. But there is a puzzle there. Because how can he believe A but deny which is also A in a way? And philosophers explain this by some philosophers explain this by saying that beliefs are guys related. Hey guys related. Meaning I believe belief, let's say belief one and belief B1 and B2. I believe B1 in one guise under certain guise, a certain way of thinking it under certain description, and B2 in certain other description. In fact, it would be better to think of it as I believe in B1 plus B2 under the veil of ignorance. And that veil for ignorance, this is Rawls's concept. The ignorance, the veil of ignorance is that I don't know that Superman is the same person as Kent, which is itself is not a very persuasive idea because he is what's his name, Kent, but Clark Kent, but as Superman he is acting somebody else. Even that belief is, I think, questionable that Superman is equal to Kent Clark. But we have done that. The Frege's puzzle is based on that supposition. Obviously, Frege's example is different. That is morning star, evening star. Anyway, now Williamson says that this can be explained that is Frege's puzzle without abandoning a simple intentionalist theory of meaning based on belief. I mean, some philosophers like Klein, for example, they abandon intentionalism altogether. They become extensionalists. But others, which Williamson is using here, become hyper-intentional, try to come up with, clever ways of modifying, and that's what he is resisting. So basically, what he is saying is same proposition different guises that is, and different behaviors that is different belief, and that's enough to explain uh, that Ali acts differently towards Superman and Clark, and why that is the case. And the reviewer is saying that no, this is just too smooth, this is too quick, it's not very well thought of. You're taking the problems less seriously than they are. And he brings in rational choice theory, the reviewer and economics. In economics, the economists use belief in or treat belief in precise intentional way, uh, so that it can neatly interface with rational choice theory, um, because what they want is your belief and what you value explains your action, what you do. So for economists who are using rational choice theory in order to explain action, economic action there, belief and values are and actions are tightly connected, and if you bring in guises, as Williamson does vaguely, then you lose the connection between this neat connection between belief, value, and actions. And at the end of the day, for both rational choice theorists and economists, the main thing is to explain the behavior of people or action of people based on their belief about what they value, etc. So, for example, the scarcity. There might not be actually scarcity, so there's no scarcity in France right now. But people believe that there is scarcity. So combined with this, even though the objective situation is different, combined with this, you can have revolution, you can have riots. So, and obviously, rational choice theory and economics both are concerned with this. So, what the reviewer is saying is that uh, Williamson doesn't realize the complexity of the problem and explains away that contradiction too lightly, which in certain cases might be all right, but for example, in other cases where in the case of rational choice theory, which economists use and which requires or which is valuable precisely because it has neat and it establishes a neat connection between belief, value, and action. This is not. This cannot be explained like that. And he refers to the version which he thinks that can take into uh, fragmentationism. Says that mind contains distinct leaf fragments. So let's do some fragmentationism. Fragmentationism, mind, according to fragmentationism, mind contains distinct leaf fragments and perspective. Um, and mind can store incompatible belief structures. And this way you can have a structured way to model Gaussian while you can assert the connection to the rational theory. And that conception of mind seems on the paper is more realistic. Anyway, let's stop here.